Attention, people of Bikini Bottom. You have been cheated and lied to. The gentle laborer shall no longer suffer from the noxious greed of Mr. Krabs. Nobody gives a care about the fate of labor as long as they can get their instant gratification.
Funnily enough, there will actually be a bit of a callback to the preview I gave in my Skyward Sword Diversions video about the intersectional question of class and race that could be humorously picked out of the Spongebob episode Fry Cook Games. I recently, and by recently I mean it's probably been a couple months by this point, but nevertheless, finished reading the book Workers on Arrival by Joe William Trotter Jr. So I figured now would be as good a time as any to write down some ideas and tackle that what Squid on Strike can teach us about labor politics video that I've wanted to make even before that little gag in my Skyward Sword stream. Yeah, actually the Fry Cook Games is more of a discussion on classism instead of racism. No, it's because SpongeBob's, saying that he's better than Patrick because he has the job of a fry cook.
We're an elite corps.
So then Patrick goes and gets a fry cook job in like 5 minutes.
Mr. SpongeBob Superior Pants.
And then SpongeBob later gets the what's it called? He when he does the ice cream dive thing, he makes a dipped chocolate ice cream with toasted almonds.
That's unexpected.
On the outside, and then Plankton's like, almonds? Curse him, that's good. But perhaps a bit too highbrow for this crowd. Now get out there and show him how the common man prepares his frozen dairy treats. So you see, there's many class under. I'm gonna take that episode along with the Squid on Strike episode. Yeah, I'm just gonna do a full labor-based analysis of SpongeBob. There's a lot more that I could dive deeply into for this video, since the story of workers and their rights go as far back as what many consider civilization to be. Much of the stuff that I am most familiar with and would have the best time describing in detail falls mostly into the American history category, and even that has a noticeable dearth. But hey, that's something you come to realize in whatever field of expertise you take up, and you can't learn and retain every single important detail, but you do learn how to recognize patterns and continue building your skills to search for and explain information. After all, part of this was just an excuse to use Squid on Strike as a meme and talk about historical topics I love. Hopefully you will gain an appreciation for history and social sciences a bit more and learn something you didn't before. Regarding labor movements, a good place to start that might not be immediately obvious to everyone, unless you are a frequenter of CrashCourse history, comes up in 14th century Europe. In the midst and aftermath of the Black Death in Europe, there was a noted movement by civilians to demand higher pay and lower rent due to the massive loss of life. Less people around meant laborers were harder to come by, and more housing and land was available. Even in an era in which feudalism was still commonplace, the working people found themselves with considerable leverage in the matter, given that anywhere from a fourth to a half of Europeans on the whole in the continent were estimated to have died during the years of the largest outbreak of the plague, as any Econ 101 course is sure to tell you.
Supply and demand.
Basically, there are these introductory economics principles known as the law of demand and the law of supply. On the demand side, the more of something that is available, the lower price it will be demanded for. Since there was so much land now available, people could now hold out of it and have more opportunity to bargain the price of rent down. After all, if landlords didn't rent out the land, what money are they going to be making on it? They sure wouldn't be able to work such land for crops or as workshops or what have you without the necessary labor force as well. That segues nicely into the supply side of things. The lower the price of something, the less it will be supplied. In this case, we're thinking of the potential labor force as suppliers. They supply their labor for pay. With the lower population, employers have fewer laborers to choose from and would have to offer greater pay if they wanted to compete with other employers that were hiring. Granted, this is a generalized picture of the situation, and any real-life economic situation will have countless factors contributing to the actual result. However, this paints an easily understandable picture of why, for at least a little while in some areas, how laborers were able to negotiate for better conditions in the wake of the Black Death. For a famous example approaching the modern era, we have the Luddites. I apologize again for being a bit Eurocentric and American-centric with the examples here, but these are just the movements in this time period that I am most familiar with. The Luddites were an anti-industrialist group that basically sought to halt the rapid technological changes being made in what is most often referred to as the First Industrial Revolution. Their reasoning was that the amount of work being reduced by implementation of new machines would eventually make them, the workers, obsolete. A theme you've no doubt heard anywhere from other mythologies like that of John Henry in the United States, to recent fears espoused by truckers and delivery workers in the advent of self-driving cars. And of course, South Park, you know.
They took our jobs! Yeah, they're down, took our jobs!
By the way, if you want a really good video going over some of the deeper history and sociological influences and consequences of the story of John Henry, I highly suggest checking out FD Signifier's Why I Don't Dream of Labor Doesn't Work video. If you're not already familiar with the topic, the story of black labor in America begins with slavery. The people in power in the American colonies recognized that it was much easier to dehumanize groups of people that could be differentiated from the population that they identified closer with. People with power in these colonies were European men of high economic or cultural status. They were given charters to enhance the power of their mother country. Since these countries wanted to make as much money as possible, using unpaid labor would help lower the costs of running these places. Enter slavery, a practice as old as human civilization itself, and indentured servitude, which legally signed people over to masters for a period of usually 4 to 7 years in exchange for the servant gang to go live in the colonies. How this all relates back to race is that those who held the most power in the system realized over time that restricting who could be a slave to people with darker skin colors served many purposes for keeping the power system unchanging. People of African descent could be readily pointed out as others to Europeans. Workers of European descent could separate what was expected of them in society from the vast majority of workers of black descent. If searching for an escaped slave, people searching would know what skin tone to look for. Even if a black person accused of being a runaway slave was just a free black person living their own life, this setup made it so as a possibility, and an inevitability, that free black people could be enslaved in colonial America, even if they weren't to begin with. These concepts and how they came to be are why we say that structural and systemic racism are real and continue to affect our society today. The powers at play condition people to notice differences between each other and act in ways to keep those differences palpable. The widespread system of slavery lasted until the end of the Civil War in 1865 and continued, either dubiously legally or adapted to exploit black laborers as much as possible well into the 1900s. Check out the neo-slavery video by Knowing Better to look a bit deeper into this topic. these systems and the social interactions they promoted would not go away in a few years' time, or decades and decades of time for that matter, with some new laws and new ways of thinking being pushed. The consequences were branching, nuanced, and lasting. Trotter pulls from a huge list of primary and secondary sources from the colonial era to recent years in American history to paint a colorful and nuanced picture of what the labor of Black Americans was like. Though it, like any other work, does not contain everything you would need to know about the history of a topic, I was drawn in by the amount of examples he could point to for making his points about how Black labor held a unique and consequential role within the building of America. Read through statistics like how many enslaved Black laborers worked on water or building projects in colonial New Orleans, or that Black people were unemployed at a rate 3 times higher than other groups in the middle of the 1960s in a specific neighborhood in New York, shows that we have a lot to draw on with just numbers alone. To indulge a bit, seeing these kinds of sources available is one of the coolest things to me as a history major. The fact that we can go through documentation giving us numbers of people and what they were doing is a godsend to understanding the whole of a situation. And it also adds to the immersion. History does have the word story in it, after all. It doesn't even end with the types of work and unemployment numbers either, as Trotter also itemizes labor union and political activist organizations and their membership throughout the years too. I never think of clubs being something that a ton of people join and interact in outside of like high school, but the explanations and imagery given in this book prove to me once again that the world is a huge place with a cornucopia of people and ideas interacting in every way all the time. Getting back from that slight digression, Trotter's work adds to the conversation of how race, class, and labor are an inseparable intersection when discussing the full picture of workers. Political and business leaders perpetuated distinctions between workers by selectively hiring certain groups of people in certain areas, times, and occupations. Strikes carried out in the first half of the 1900s by auto workers, for instance, gave us glimpses of both interracial cooperation for better working conditions, along with continued racial intolerance and business leaders exploiting such sentiments. The cycle kept spinning of societal elites, pitting different intersectionalities against each other so such groups wouldn't cooperate, and workers holding on to ideas of discrimination from the socially ingrained history of segregation. The 1950s and 60s ushering in a massive wave of support for civil rights did not deter, but rather prompted pushback from existing power structures. White political leaders across the country, like in an example from Pennsylvania that Trotter gave during this time, expressed extreme hesitance, including Black people in campaigning and labor activist movements because they wanted to keep white laborers on their side. This sort of thing was pointed out by commentators during the period of American slavery as well, just one example of which can be found in this March 10th, 1848 issue of the abolitionist newspaper, The North Star. The poor white man will learn that his rights are wrapped up in the same bundle with the black man's, and that the rights of one cannot be violated without affecting those of the other. Oh my God. Okay guys, I know I was just saying that the Spongebob episodes were just an excuse to talk about labor history and how cool it is, but I'm now convincing myself that the Fry Cook Games are legitimately commentary on the role of race in labor politics. Mr. Krabs and Plankton are the businessmen looking to profit off of the disagreements and tensions between the laborers. Listen to the first pep talk here of Krabs and Plankton.
Friend? Not in here, he ain't.
He's not really your friend.
He's not?
He's plotting your downfall right now.
He's gonna stab you in the back.
Of course he would. Just look at him. Square. The shape of evil.
If that's not enough, I mean, listen to the frickin' bun wrestling pep talk.
Don't forget, he called ye yellow.
Don't forget, he called you pink.
Come on, there's at least a modicum of something labor-race relations here. Anyone somewhat familiar with meme culture is aware of the Soviet national anthem, seizing the memes of production and portraits of Mao, Lenin, and Marx. Just to make sure everyone here gets on the same page, though, each of those people lived in different times with different contexts and, quite frankly, different ideologies in politics. It seems to be a trend, especially in the US, to equate Marx's ideas to Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, which lends to the thinking that Marxism equals communism, equals socialism, equals liberals, equals the government does stuff, equals the government is always watching / forcing you to do something. So let's clear those up in at least a little detail, so I can actually get to talking about what Marx's ideas are and how me talking about him does not mean endorsing Stalin. Liberalism was a political ideology that is associated with one of the main schools of thought to come out of the intellectual circles in the European Enlightenment. Its general original set of ideas roughly aligned with promoting more social freedoms and tolerance, international cooperation, and open and free trade policies. Basically a list of ideas including everything from allowing people to follow which religion they want, as long as it isn't harming others, people wanting to reduce conflict as much as possible, so more political and economic dependence on and assistance to each other should be sought, and what would become the groundwork for modern capitalism thanks to theories and works by Adam Smith and others. That's right, liberal basically used to mean policy that wanted more unfettered trade. Simplifying that a bit because Smith definitely also warned against taking some of these ideas too far, and that there should of course be some regulations to prevent bad actors from taking advantage of things. Good thing that's the only term for policies coming from a political ideological party thing that is going to change drastically over time, right? Right? Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were sociologists from the mid to late 1800s from the German states that also lived in England and wrote and published the Communist Manifesto. The main takeaway from it is that Marx theorized that workers were becoming increasingly unfairly treated by the owners of factories and other means of production of wealth, and that they would eventually rise up to take control of such means from the owners. This is the essential original idea of what communism would be, creating a worldwide community of workers to share in the wealth and prevent too much wealth pooling into a small elite class that did not deal with day-to-day challenges that the workers actually dealt with. Socialism was a related theory that emerged in the popular intellectualism and policy suggestions of the time as well. It was a set of ideas more often accepted by a wider range of political actors due to it not as directly targeting those with wealth for abolishment of their wealth. Socialist policies advocate more along the lines of providing what we now call social safety nets, as well as what many of us would hopefully consider reasonable and necessary regulations on government and business. You know, making sure workers don't get screwed because they got an arm chopped off in the factory or were forced to work for 16 hours and made it to work late the next day because of it, or making sure the bread isn't made up of more than 10% sawdust. Marx and Engels criticized the socialist groups of their time basically for not going far enough to actually deal with the root of the problem. Vladimir Lenin was a revolutionary leader during the Russian revolutions of the early 1900s that finally rose to power in the twilight of World War I, after his political party, the Bolsheviks, ousted the Romanov royal family. He had some ideas that added more dimension to Marx's original theories, such as the idea that the wealthy European countries and their wealthy classes were not facing the consequences that Marx predicted because the standard of living was increased just enough for the lower classes in these countries because of the resources and labor that the countries could exploit instead from their empires in Africa and Asia. Lenin also altered some of the base aspects of Marx's work by suggesting that instead of the workers themselves rising up to take the means of production, they would need a powerful leading party to do it for them, thereby justifying, in his view, the heavy-handed reign that he would begin for the new Russian country. This got turned up to 11 by Stalin, who doubled down on his word being the only word that should be heeded, turning even further away from the expectation that workers should be in charge of the means of production, and instead making all the major economic policy decisions by himself and with his closest advisors. He tried as hard as he could to make himself the undisputed totalitarianist ruler of the USSR by continuing policies of Russifying and exploiting satellite states such as Ukraine. Suffice to say, stealing grain crops from Ukrainians and forcing Lithuanians to speak Russian and forget their history or die does not exactly seem like the original Marxist ideas of the oppressed workers joining together to dethrone the ruling classes, but hey, what do I know? Mao Zedong took more of an agricultural or agrarian-based interpretation of Marx's theories, arguing more along the lines that greedy landlords and bureaucrats were the reason for the plight of the masses of peasants in China. After helping lead his forces to victory over the nationalist faction of the Chinese armies, led by Chiang Kai-shek, Mao and his party implemented policies to try to address these concerns for the lower class people. This resulted in a bit of a, overcorrection in a lot of ways, as especially in the 5-year plans that came after his original 5-year plan, professionals such as doctors, teachers, so on, would be sent to labor camps in the countryside, causing brain drain effects and management issues. Didn't help that policies to make farmers also try to smelt metal and targeted killing of sparrows, which would have otherwise helped keep crop-eating insects in check, while also exporting grains that were sorely needed for food for the workers, were also enacted. A lot of people died. Once again, don't think this leader actually had the right ideas and/or morals when trying to help the workers of their country, but again, what do I know? I really want to get to actually comparing a bit of Marxism to the Spongebob stuff here, but I feel like I should also address this just because it is something that is strangely still prevalent in ignorance and misinformation by right-wing individuals and groups. Nazi Germany was not socialist or communist or Marxist or any of that. Bad actors or ignorant people will point out that part of the Nazi name stands for socialist, but it shouldn't and doesn't take much more looking past this to see that Hitler's Germany was, 1, outwardly and explicitly attacking socialists, communists, and other labor union members in Germany and the areas it took over. 2, they went to war against Stalin, who, even though I said was not much of an actual communist, was still very clearly painted as the communist boogeyman by Hitler and others. Even if you ignore all of that, Nazi Germany certainly did not create social safety programs for all its citizens, as they very clearly were constantly creating more and more anti-social safety programs in the form of concentration and death camps for various groups within the wider population. If you ever hear some Fox News pundit or conservative politician saying that liberals are recreating the Holocaust by making people take vaccines or being too woke because they want people who say racist things to face the natural consequences for doing so, they either don't know their history or actively trying to sow more political discord by spreading blatant misinformation and acting like somebody trying to call you out for being racist is the same thing as perpetuating the enslavement and murder of millions of people. Seems like we went off on big tangents there. Gotta make sure people understand vocabulary and context, because otherwise people might walk away with the wrong or incomplete ideas. Thanks to Cold War propaganda, hatred of socialism and communism as words alone continue to be ingrained in at least American society. So it probably does make sense to try new branding or meshing with progressivism, however that ends up looking. Though that would not be an easy path either, probably. Especially since progressive seems to be being demonized at this point by the right as well. Basically anything that doesn't fall in line with Trumpism or capitalism or maintaining the status quo or even regressing from what the current status quo is. Now then, back to the reason why you're all here, Squidward and his labor politics. The thing I want to do now is take Squidward's speech and methods and see how much those line up with the famous strikes from the late 1800s to the early 1900s in America. Remember how Adam Smith brought about some of the main ideas that would turn into modern capitalism, but also put out some cautionary thoughts alongside it to make sure people would still be taken care of and not worked into the ground or tossed aside for profit's sake? Yeah, the Gilded Age in the US went all in on the capitalism and all out on the exploiting workers and the economy in general. The top steel, railroads, oil, and even sugar companies came to control unprecedented amounts of their respective industries, approaching the end of the 19th century. The Standard Oil and EC Knight Sugar companies, for example, each owned more than 90% of the production of their respective products in the US at their heights. It didn't stop at their own base industries either, as they would also buy out rights to use, build, or own railroads, mines, and land for all parts of the production process, a concept known as vertical integration. This, of course, led to these companies holding an insane amount of power. They had so much wealth and money that they could put other companies in their fields out of business by selling products at a lower price. Smaller companies couldn't compete because they couldn't afford to lower their prices, so people would buy their product instead of the larger companies. The larger companies could take the profit hit until the smaller companies either went out of business or agreed to sell themselves out to the larger company. The US government would start to address these monopolies with time, but it took a couple decades for some decent legislature to get passed, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. And for these acts that did seek to even the playing field a bit, there were also executive actions and allowances that went opposite to looking out for the good of workers and for perpetuating the power that these companies held. Preceding the Gilded Age, progress for labor rights had a few notable successes it could point to. Of course, there was the one hopefully most people are familiar with, in that slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. Except as punishment for crimes. Oh well, I'm sure that won't be abused on both individual and systematic levels, right? Right? Even further back than that, the state of Massachusetts set the stage for improving both the legal perception of labor movements and the state of labor itself in 1842, by ruling that unions were, in fact, legal, so long as they themselves were not breaking laws to advocate, and that children should be limited to 10 hours of work a day. Sure, that sounds a bit insane today, but hey, it was progress then, and it eventually led us to not neglecting the right of kids to be kids today, right? Anyway, several other states followed suit with some reductions to workday hours. As is the trend though, plenty of hard battles continued to be fought, with several strikes during the sectional crisis and Civil War being carried out to varying degrees of success. Negligence and outright violence often coincided with the more vulnerable and discriminated sections of society. I'm going to go through a few examples in at least some detail here, but also give a bit of a list of a few others that you can look into just as further examples if that interests you. Though sentiment towards Irish immigrants and descendants might not have been as bad as it was during the late 1840s due to the massive influx of migration in response to the Irish potato famine and spiking nativism in America, that sort of sentiment does not dissipate in 30 years' time. For those of you unfamiliar, nativism refers to people who were born and raised in the US and harboring ill feelings towards immigrants, not American Indian Native Americans. Kind of ironic considering their parents and grandparents, and sometimes even those current nativists themselves, lived on land taken from the American Indians or even actively contributed to the further displacement of Native Americans. But these are
the common clay of the New West. You know. Morons.
people who were kids then were now working adults, and adults who lived through the riots were now onlookers or even still elderly workers in a same shit different day situation. The echoes of these relations are still heard today, as white Americans complained of people of Irish and black descent flooding the labor market and taking their jobs at lower wages, while missing or being misled on the trend of the business leaders providing these jobs making more money than ever before and not sharing that prosperity with the workers. Especially early on, again thanks to both nativism in the US and osmosis of British propaganda about Irish people, the Irish were seen as comparable to black people in American social hierarchy. Sometimes this led to unity, as with Frederick Douglass collaborating with Ireland for abolishing slavery and advancing labor rights. Other times, however, racist sentiment was stoked by those that stood to gain from the separation of the large working class population. One explosive instance of this happened during the Civil War, which showcased how even when a war that increasingly over time shifted toward a goal of not just reuniting the country, but reuniting it without the continuation of slavery, that it was not just a clear-cut story of North versus South, anti-slavery versus slavery, anti-racism versus racism. The New York draft riots of 1963 were a response to the implementation of the military draft enacted by the Union to fuel the war effort, along with coinciding factors. Economic issues were caused by the separation of the North and South, such as the large northern textile industries not having raw cotton material to turn to products. Nativists continued having ill will towards Irish immigrants, and even immigrants themselves were buying into arguments that black people escaping from the South to the North would make the labor market more difficult. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation confirmed that the war was not only for preserving the Union, but for freeing slaves in the southern states. Yeah, it didn't say anything about banning slavery as a whole so they could keep the border states on the north side. Racist sentiments that already existed were exacerbated by this shift, and even those who might not ascribe to racist ideas outright continuously had information to link economic troubles with race and ethnicity. A mandatory call to arms on top of all of this broke the camel's back and resulted in these riots. The fact that many of the rioters were Irish Americans further showed the complexity of race relations in the United States, considering how poorly immigrants were received. In a society with a hierarchy like that of slavery-era America, finding a place where you're at least not on the lowest rung seemed to be appealing to most people. It still is today in a different yet similar sense. Check out Innuendo Studios' There's Always a Bigger Fish for a bit more on that concept. It gets even more disheartening when 10 years later, when the Civil War is finished and more time has passed for Irish people to potentially be accepted, several Irish people were executed in the larger context of the Pennsylvania miners' strike. Many more gains for the rights of everyone would need to be garnered, even with the monumental achievements of the Union victory in the Civil War and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Laws alone would not eliminate the prejudices, both personal and structural, in the country, and big businesses would continue exploiting workers while the struggle to lower racial and ethnic tensions raged on. Wages suffered in the aftermath of the Panic of 1873, one of many recessions to take place in the 19th century, and one of the most high-profile strikes to occur in this context was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The University of Houston details the violence that took place in cities like Baltimore and Pittsburgh, where 10 and 40, respectively, were killed in skirmishes between protesters and militia and federal troops. Commentators from the time blamed much of the violence on immigrant workers. The commonality between the prominent strikes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was that workers were bearing the brunt of economic issues rather than corporate owners. Whether these events were characterized by similar casualties from law enforcement and civilians, or essentially complete nonviolence, blame and fears became outsized on workers as a societal whole. Destruction and harm did come from worker demonstrations, no doubt, but companies continued to utilize private organizations like the Pinkertons to sabotage labor efforts through direct threats or infiltration with little legal or financial recourse. The context of the time period was nuanced in that even though reforms started occurring in the Progressive Era, actions taken by the federal government were often not enough to prevent continued power consolidation. The end of World War I also coincided with the Red Scare, due to the formation of the Soviet Union, which resulted in further reactions from governmental and non-governmental actors alike to dismiss and quash strikes and workers' rights demands. Even with incidents like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, which killed over 140 people, mostly women, due to the willful business owner negligence of safety conditions. Even with the 1919 Seattle General Strike being virtually nonviolent despite threats of martial law. When workers did use violence to retaliate, such as in the case of the Battle of Blair Mountain, it was after parlays were broken down by business owners wanting to maintain the status quo. A status quo which in this case was made up of workers being paid with company currency rather than real dollars. One of the shows of force chosen by the business owners to quell the uprising they helped fuel, bomber planes, for use on American civilians. The Tulsa Massacre is a focal point of race relations due to certain points of context. Like other such events, it started with dubious claims of assault on a white woman by a black man that escalated into white mobs lynching black people. However, this relates to the labor facet as well, because Tulsa had a notably successful population of black business owners. Institutionalized racism still permeated society clearly in the 1920s, if Jim Crow laws were just one thing to go by, and many white people were not okay with this outward success. This success might have suggested social progress, but the destruction of black neighborhoods without recourse towards the white rioters showed that a clear racial hierarchy still flourished. Hopefully by this point you can guess this wasn't an isolated incident, but check out other examples like Springfield or Omaha riots for more as well. I'm realizing at this point I haven't talked much about unions yet, and that's probably just a little important for a labor history video, so let's talk a bit about that before moving on to another book I read that displays a microcosm of labor and race in America. The idea of a union is simple. If all the workers band together, they will have the power to make demands to their employers. If workers agree to not work until wages, working conditions, and other demands are met, then business owners will lose money since the businesses are not producing output.
Soon he'll realize he needs us more than we need him. We are Workers United!
Some of the largest unions created in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States included the Industrial Workers of the World, Knights of Labor, and American Federation of Labor. They varied in the exact goals they focused on and their methods for achieving such goals, but they all sought to improve the lot of laborers through pressuring business owners, and sometimes the government, to change the rules to do so. Labor organizations and their allies prompted societal shifts, such as the 8-hour workday, as opposed to the 10 and longer hour workdays, greater workplace safety protocols, and reduction of child labor. The history of unions has some notable blights on it regarding race relations, however. Many unions early on did not even consider collaboration with workers of different races. Some sectors caught on earlier rather than later, such as mining labor organizations with their relatively more diverse workforce requiring greater cooperation to get demands met. Just like larger American society, however, reactionary elements took every opportunity available to resist racial solidarity, even when cooperation and equality would help raise everybody's votes. You can't separate race from discussions about economic and employment issues due to the spillover and continuations from the systems of slavery, Native American removal, and nativism. As part of the wave of worker protests across America in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, plenty were taking place in its southwest territories and even across the border in Mexico. Anglo-Saxon, Hispanic, and black workers alike were subjected to subpar and dangerous working conditions and hours. For this reason, as those at the time and scholars today alike will point out, there was ample reason for interracial cooperation to demand greater pay and regulation from mining companies in the area.
However,
due to ingrained racism from societal pressures both at the ground level and from business leaders cajoling, it sometimes only took a chance event involving culturally noticeable aspects of involved persons to erupt tensions. One event I learned about from a book we read in my college American West class was the Great Arizona Orphan Abduction by Linda Gordon. In a mining town in Clifton, Morenci, Arizona, in 1904, a train of Irish orphans arrived to be adopted by Mexican families in the area. The Catholic sponsors of the project, recognizing the relative proclivity of Catholicism in Mexican families compared to Anglo families for the time and place. Despite just a few decades earlier, Irish people very much being considered beneath the white races of Americans, the specific spatial temporal context these children arrived into meant that the Anglo community saw white-skinned children first and foremost. Though I don't want to encourage making religious decisions for children, I don't exactly think the Anglo community forming armed mobs to take the legally adopted children from the Mexican community was a good alternative. The mental damage this did to the community and children was a lot, to say the least, already. But this also just ended up being another log thrown onto the fire of socially constructed superiority. The book goes to great lengths to recount the entire recent background of the town and its surroundings, details of how the businesses treated Mexican workers compared to Anglo workers is presented in Gordon's research. Management literature on how to handle Mexican workers repeatedly observed that the men took great offense at familiarity, obscenity, or peremptory language. One manager suggested that a smile and a cigarette will go further than a substantial pay raise in wages, if accompanied with sourness. If posts from today's workers about pizza party rewards are any indication, I think many of us can feel some connection to this. The more things change, the more they stay the same. We can also get a glimpse into the further stratification of the society in Clifton, Morenci, as well as company town era America in general, thanks to the descriptions of social and work opportunities and company provide housing and department stores. To speedrun this, let's see. Anglos earning 1.5 times the wages earned by Mexicans, management positions restricted to Anglo workers, neighborhoods initially being segregated despite Mexican workers building all the houses and taking most housekeeping jobs, town clubs being restricted to Anglo membership, the company store making it hard for local Mexican and Chinese businesses to stay afloat, docking the pay of workers during holiday celebrations because their kids got gifts from said store. That was an 8% run, by the way. If I want to go for the 100% run, I also have to go further into school segregation or even more nuanced social slights that happened to Mexican families, such as equating the fact that wages were generally lower in Mexico to some social Darwinist ideas like Mexicans needing less to live than their Anglo counterparts. If all this company town talk hasn't gotten you riled up enough, I'll refer you back to Knowing Better again for some more examples of this American and sometimes exported to other areas phenomenon. I also suggest looking up how the Porfirio Mexican regime was all too keen to go along with US policies thanks to the support the US gave this not so democratic leader at the time. All this being said, though, there was clear impetus and even steps taken for interracial workers' rights movements in the area. Worker occupation levels were heavily segregated, and about half the Anglo smelting workers at Arizona Copper were laborers, while the same occupational title applied to 97.5% of Mexican workers there. Again, these statistics come from the research of Gordon. This didn't mean Mexicans were the only ones voting for socialist candidates, though, as no group is completely unanimous with their ideas, and only 22% of the voting population demographic was Mexican men. Gordon reports from her research further that during different elections this period, 15 to 28% of men here voted for socialist office holders. Combine that with socialist ideals being able to appeal to various levels of education and socioeconomic status, but also politics not always just being about policy, and you have good reason to believe that a good amount of interracial union work was in order. Clearly, this is where I connect back to Spongebob and Squidward portraying this idea in Squid on Strike, due to them teaming up to strike despite different end goals. This is also a good opportunity to bring up how the concept of public perception fits into everything as well. In Squidward's case, the public seems supportive at a basic level, but falters on their backing once they realize they are hungry and, well, there's a beloved eating establishment right in front of them. The Great Arizona Orphan Abduction details how the support of the local community was pivotal to the logistics of carrying out worker demonstrations, providing sustenance and respite to the workers. Conversely, strikes I previously touched on, such as the 1919 Seattle strike, fell to the drain from the relative lack of continuous support by the public. Even with the strike being described as completely peaceful, the first Red Scare going on at the time severely hampered attempts to deeply appeal to both the Seattle and American public. Squidward brings up an issue often experienced in strikes that's also exploited by business owners and conservative and reactionary elements: picket line crossers, or scabs.
You just let your replacement cross our picket line without so much as a single threat.
The idea is that businesses will try to keep going despite the refusal of most or all workers to not work until conditions are negotiated and improved. It is, of course, important to prevent any work being done to force the business owners to come to the negotiation table so they can get back to making money. To keep profits as high as they can, the owners would rather try to force workers back to the status quo, instead of improving wages and conditions. To this end, owners may find a few workers who are willing to break the strike solidarity, or they may be trying to bring in new workers. These new workers would often be racial minorities who were previously discriminated against in the hiring process, so they would be more likely to want to accept the job offers, given that structural difficulty in procuring stable work and pay. The history of racial segregation and antagonism in the country could then be weaponized by the owners, as the original white workers would be more easily convinced that non-white workers undercut their labor by taking lower wages. If the workers banded together, they could secure much more potential leverage in negotiations with the business owners, but the social, economical, and historical circumstances combined made exploitation of workers and sabotage of labor movements more effective. It's something that's still seen widely in conversations around labor today.
They took our jobs!
The Flint, Michigan General Motors strike of 1936 to 1937, while not able to eliminate the deeper societal issues with labor and race relations, did add to the credibility of the practicality of the emerging sit-in protest strategy. They would still go to work, but simply occupy the plant without doing any work. This way they would still cost the company money while preventing potential scabs from working. It was also an event that proved the continued willingness of owners to utilize violence through police forces to threaten and attack workers like the eras before. Luckily for the workers, their efforts and determination paid off despite these difficulties, thanks to President Franklin Roosevelt pushing for GM to allow unions to operate. If this happened while Reagan was in office, we might have seen a different outcome given what he did to air traffic operators when they went on strike. Worker solidarity is what allows strikes to get as far as they do, but they need allies in government if they're going to get meaningful and future success. A lot easier to expand people's rights when the government doesn't allow tear gas, machine guns, and, oh yeah, bombers in the case of Blair Mountain to be used against workers. The start of the civil rights movement was born from the height of World War II and set the stage for nationwide reckoning with racial inequality and all of the social, legal, and economic aspects that accompanied it. Some initial big moments included the Double V campaign, the 1941 Ford strike, seeing both black and white workers under the banner of the CIO, or Congress of Industrial Organizations, and UAW, United Automobile Workers of America, and FDR passing Executive Order 8802 to prevent government job racial discrimination. President Truman approved the desegregation of armed forces after World War II. The Supreme Court ordered desegregation of schools with the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, and President Eisenhower utilized federal troops to ensure peaceful integration of high school students in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. In the face of conservative and reactionary backlash and maneuvering, minorities bearing the brunt, fighting for their rights on the ground, had some notable government support in moving towards equality. There would be plenty of other instances of assisted programs, but also missed opportunities and even regression by the US government in this movement. Even the whitewashed history propagated since around the time of Reagan's presidency and the creation of the federal holiday of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Check out this Second Thought video and a multitude of videos by FD Signifier regarding this. Most people are still familiar with the manner of many of the protests King supervised. Nonviolent protest was championed as a way to emphasize the plight of the workers, garner more sympathy from potential supporters, and maybe even give a bit of credence, whether it would actually be received or not, to the ideal of breaking the cycle of violence. As anyone who actually looks into MLK's history knows, his views were not as simple as never do violence, and much of America's white population actually held disapproving views of King until Reagan's efforts to rebrand MLK because, well, King was black, anti-war, and a socialist that wanted legitimate change. With all that being clear, though, it was still quite accurate that plenty of others before, during, and after King's life as a civil rights leader championed non-violent protests, such as marches, but also including sit-ins. The Greensboro, North Carolina sit-in of 1960 being one of these famous movements showed that this was an effective tactic even outside of the workplace, like we saw in the auto workers' strikes of the Great Depression. It showed even onlookers with the smallest amount of context that there was no behavior here that suggested moral depravity, and lowered the chances of the message getting muddied by media bias towards violent happenings. This protest took place at a segregated restaurant by 4 black university students that eventually ballooned into hundreds. Reactionaries to the efforts to desegregate, harass, and attack the protesters called in bomb threats and eventually got several dozen arrested for trespassing. Interestingly enough, in this instance, as far as I can tell from the sources I found, linked below and put on screen here, the police did not even intervene violently, despite the restaurant owner calling very early on for the removal of the students. These arrests only spurred many others to create waves of similar sit-ins and boycotts that would cause restaurants and other businesses to start giving into the pressure and begin integrating. While Greensboro wasn't necessarily a labor strike, it was part of the larger goals sought by non-white activists to eliminate segregation of public spaces and social opportunities alike. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, while also not directly a strike, was fighting much for the same outcomes as any strike would have. Connecting back to Squid on Strike, it relates very cleanly to Squidward's voice demands.
We've got to unite as workers and demand the respect we deserve from the boss. We will dismantle oppression board by board, even if it takes an eternity.
This march reiterates the point that racial issues are embedded into other aspects of inequality in society. The organizers' list of goals include demands that addressed all areas of the social web, such as voting rights protections, desegregation of schools, and federal investment in training and education programs for workers. See this summary from Stanford University for more details and links. The I Have a Dream speech that defines most people's passing knowledge of this event further shows the all-encompassing nature of the March for Jobs and Freedom, but also relays frustration. The focal point of the event being this speech, and the speech oftentimes being watered down even more into short quotes rather than taken into account as part of the larger movement, harms the full message. Conservative elements were, and still are not, much of a fan of what Martin Luther King Jr. said and did in his life. So there's been corrupting of the phrases from the speech like, not judging by the color of skin but by character. Read on its own, people might think that King wanted us to stop paying attention to race altogether. This grossly miscommunicates what the march and the rest of the civil rights movement was about, though, as racism and its effects would not simply go away on their own. Non-white people have been at a disadvantage in terms of being accepted for adequate schooling, jobs, housing, and so on for decades upon decades. Even with the momentum of the movement, this was not going to change rapidly enough for everyone to stop considering race when figuring out how to address issues in the country. Once again, plenty of examples can be pointed to from the past 30 years or even last year to show that racial divides continue to exist despite the successes of the civil rights movement. Drawing attention away from the larger implications and impacts racism has had on all aspects of life and the programs meant to address those is the goal of such conservative and reactionary elements, even though such programs could help all Americans regardless of race. Before King's assassination, both local and federal governments were disdainful of King, despite what us having a national holiday for him might suggest. Local Southern governments, of course, didn't like that he was trying to make gains for social and economic rights. This movement taking place during the Cold War meant PR problems for King. He preached for dignity, opportunity, and assistance for all people, including outside of the US. Like many people at the time, he opposed the Vietnam War due to reports about the wanton destruction and war crimes taking place there at the hands of the US military. It meant that counter-movements could play upon the severe anti-communist sentiments of the time, and attack King's social standing and stymie any movements and groups perceived to be related to him. As relatively receptive as the Kennedy and Johnson administrations were to championing legislation for reducing poverty and advancing equality, communism was perceived as the ultimate enemy to the US.
Commie! Yeah, go get him, Dwight.
This, on top of the ardent racist reactions to the civil rights movement, meant it was only a matter of time until King was assassinated. These administrations were able to catapult several of the demands set out by the movement, as seen through the Voting Rights Act and War on Poverty measures, but many of these programs were also robbed of their full potential by following conservatism. Nixon and Reagan were not exactly fans of black people, despite Reagan's passing of the national holiday for King. Again, King's legacy was reduced to being a nonviolent figure without much attention to what he fought for, aside from the judging not by color but quality line. Kind of easy to twist his legacy if that is what most people's extent of knowledge about him is. Oh yeah, here are some quotes from those presidents just to illustrate their thoughts on black people. Reagan's war on drugs resulted in the mass incarceration of black people due to his own administration allowing the propagation of drugs into America by supporting groups like the Contras in Nicaragua. And disproportionately sentencing black people from such importations. And remember, the 13th Amendment forbids forced labor except as what? Oh yeah, punishment for a crime.
The percentage of Americans in the prison system has doubled since 1985.
But yeah, Carter is considered a bad president because he was given a situation with Iran that no president would be able to solve easily, sure. And sure, Reagan may have been a racist, sold weapons to drug traffickers and future terrorist groups, and supported a genocidal leader in Guatemala, but hey, at least he helped the economy, right? Wait, what? He fired 10,000 striking air traffic controllers? Like, very important, highly trained laborers? And this emboldened businesses to break strikes and overall weaken union negotiating power? And he cut taxes on the wealthy, which meant less money to support the majority of America, the working class. The workers on the ground get things done, but when the president is against you, there's only going to be so much that can be done. Those in power have privilege, and should use it to support those who don't. Wait, was Spider-Man woke? Reagan was president 40 years ago. These sentiments do not disappear within a few decades. The civil rights movement also involved more minority groups than just black Americans. Look at the Chicano movement and the Stonewall Riot as just some of the introduction points. We can keep analyzing race and labor relations through Latino history as well. Going into the modern day, and other minority groups also enter the conversation considering the immigration angle. Focusing on the Latin American example due to its media prevalence and my relative familiarity with the subject though, a long string of historical events presents a more complex picture than many people may think at first. If we want to go all the way back, of course, we can by establishing that American Indians arrived in the Americas tens of thousands of years before the first Europeans. The Spanish were the first Europeans to permanently colonize the Americas, though, and they took control from the major American civilizations of the Aztecs and Incas through the formation of alliances and the consequences of European diseases on Native Americans. Their land claims would reach all the way from California and the Rocky Mountains down through Mexico and Central America until the southern reaches of the Incan Empire in the Andes Mountains. Now this control is not exactly stable, with there being relatively few Spaniards and plenty more American Indians not willing to submit to Spanish rule, but hey, at least they were pretty much in charge in Mexico City and Lima. That is until after years of slavery and servitude suffered by the natives and discontent by citizens of mixed Spanish and native ancestry not being allowed the same privileges as those from Spain itself, A certain spark ignited a wildfire of change. The United States' successful revolution against the British was one of the final motivating events that helped grow the seeds of discontent already being planted by priests, community leaders, and local elites. The Latin American revolutions of the 1800s would produce the modern-day countries of Mexico, Guatemala, Bolivia, Argentina. Oh yeah. And when Mexico kicked Spain out, it kept the ideal borders Spain had on the map, so it still went all the way into what is California, Texas, Colorado, and such. That changed when US President James Polk wanted to buy the land from Mexico, but President Santa Anna, not wanting to sell, decided to send some troops down to the Texas-Mexico border for no particular reason, right? It's not like Anglo settlers had helped locals stir rebellion in Texas in the 1830s, turned it into its own country, joined the US soon after, and now in 1846 President Polk was mad that Mexico didn't want to sell and thus lose more land, right? Oh wait, that's exactly what happened. Well, war breaks out due to the flaring of militaries across the border, and the US wins in a couple years, thanks in large part to the civil unrest Mexico was dealing with at the time. The US takes control of all the area previously mentioned on the map up to the current day border, except for this little strip in Arizona. They would buy that a little bit later. Oh yeah, and there's still some autonomous nations like the Comanche, Apache, and Navajo that actually controlled these areas in large part. But hey, at least the US had the decency to pay Mexico $15 million for the trouble. Some weird interactions between the US and Mexico happen over the next several decades, including the US helping get rid of a French invasion in Mexico, US business interests supporting a Mexican dictator until another revolution takes place in 1910, and Mexico letting the US know that Germany wanted them to invade the US during World War I. Bit of a roller coaster ride there. Okay, getting to World War II, now begins the modern story, I guess you could say. U.S. entry into World War II meant that jobs are being left behind in the home country, as well as more jobs being needed to fill for the war effort. Women famously stepped up to the plate as portrayed by Rosie the Riveter propaganda pieces, but an institution between the U.S. and Mexico was born to address the situation as well. Starting in 1942, the Bracero program was basically that time period's version of the work visa or green card. Mexican nationals, as well as some Americans that were wrongly deported in previous years, were given contracts to come work in the now underemployed agricultural sector of the Southwest United States. Though this was a welcome opportunity for jobs by a needy population, there was, unsurprisingly at this point, still discrimination and mistreatment for these workers. Like with company towns before it, workers might be charged extra for housing or be exposed to harmful chemicals. The program officially ended in 1964, but opportunities for work for Mexicans would continue in the U.S. due to the established history and geographic connectivity. Worker visa laws began 25 years before the Bracero program started and were amended at various points throughout the 1900s. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 put an official cap on visas from the Western Hemisphere, that is the rest of North and South America, to the U.S., but also made it easier for immediate families to gain entrance and be exempted from the caps. Much like African Americans at the time, Latino Americans would face social and labor discrimination challenges and gave us some interesting examples to look at for labor and racial political history. In that same year of 1965, Filipino farm workers, whose country also had a history of colonization by the Spanish and then later America, began a strike on the Delano grape farms in California in a bid to get better wages. There were many Mexican workers who could potentially be hired to fill the strikers' jobs, but leadership of the National Farm Workers Association, or NFWA, including Cesar Chavez, opted to support the Filipino strikers instead. Again, the idea is that with worker unity and solidarity, employers will have to give in to demands and raise everybody's boat if they want to get anything done. In this particular case, the employers got around this regional solidarity by bringing in workers from other states that were not privy to the situation. The NFWA, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, responded to this maneuver by them boycotting the grapes and the products made from them. A combination of committing to not buying from the related companies and publicizing the struggle of the workers was enough to put a notable dent in the company's profits. Since the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964 and continued campaigns to ensure equality went on, organizers recognized and utilized this intersection of fighting for rights when presenting their case to the public and to the government. Like the March on Washington for Jobs, we can clearly see that racial equality was connected to economic equality and other areas of social equality. In the later part of the 1900s, evolving business structures and economic changes made the issues more complicated and reflected some past lessons as well. With memes about Detroit and Ohio stereotypes, there's at least a base level understanding of the Rust Belt in the Midwestern United States. To keep the story somewhat short, the once burgeoning auto industry of this area that provided many jobs to even minority groups started being dismantled by those very same car companies as the century rolled along. Not because they were going out of business, but because adjustments to their supply chains were being made. Communication and shipping was becoming much quicker and cost-effective, and many developing countries had lower wage and regulation standards than the US. Companies decided they could save money by shifting much of the production to places like Mexico, and this resulted in localized, economically depressed areas like Detroit, Gary, and Cleveland. These new plants, often set up right across the Mexican border, are often known as maquiladoras. Some things about this are good, such as providing work to Mexicans that need the income and allowing the US to produce goods cheaper to compete on the world market. However, as I already suggested, it did come at the cost of the jobs of US workers. Theoretically, new jobs could enter the market as companies of the government reinvest in the area, but that would require the will of these entities to do so. If the auto companies can just keep chugging along well, now that they have an even higher profit margin thanks to the cheaper international labor, why should they create new jobs for these workers they just replaced? Government work programs can help in depression-like situations like this by at least providing employment for a while, but this trend was really going off when conservative presidents like Nixon, Reagan, and Bush Sr. were in office. Republicans being the party of low spending on social programs meant this wasn't happening. Republicans also just so happening to be the party of electing people with racist tendencies also meant that there would likely be no pushback if political pundits suggested it was Mexicans taking the jobs of Americans that was the problem. Even though, it was American businessmen who decided to replace those American workers in the first place. The fact that this has been going on for decades at this point, and companies having shown that they very much enjoy the lower labor costs, makes pushes by Trump to reindustrialize America not exactly a good idea either, though. Factories that have been decommissioned or dismantled entirely would take large investments up front and years to build. Business leaders don't want to do that. They want to keep seeing their quarterly profits go up, which means keep looking for the shortest term gains and preventing those short-term losses. We can bring other issues into this conversation as well. Renewable energy and scientific research provide great potential for getting people jobs. If education was more invested in, people could go back to school easier and be trained for these newer jobs. They would receive higher income and be able to contribute more to the economy. The problem is Trump and the Republicans and business interests supporting him do not want any of this. Climate change being presented by them as not a big deal means that fossil fuel industries can keep drilling and making money and donate to Republicans who keep the cycle going. An uneducated population will be less likely to look into easily falsifiable claims of climate change not being real, or immigrants being the reason there are no jobs. As long as people are making just enough money to eat and pay rent, and have to work long or multiple jobs to do so, they'll be too tired to resist and demand changes. Political discourse from the re-election of Trump and his planned appointees reflect realities from the labor situation of the US. Racist tendencies continue the push for deporting even those who have gone through all the legal hoops to get here. See Trump's words themselves. Supply and demand suggest this will result in higher food prices due to the at least initial downsizing of willing laborers for crop fields. Some immigrants seem to be relatively accepted by Trump and Musk despite their history of controversial comments regarding immigrants and race, as evidenced by news stories and social media statements highlighting their pro-H-1B work visa stance. The race element is introduced due to the majority of the recipients of such visas being Indian nationals. We'll have to wait and see how this administration really will handle this situation and whether business interests will overpower racist and nationalist sentiments. History and outcry in social and traditional media alike have me quite skeptical things will go smoothly, but we'll see. Oh look, there's another thing too. Department of Labor pages being taken down. More elimination of information by the Trump administration. Yay. There were plenty of moments throughout making this in which I reconsidered exactly what I wanted this video to be. As a history degree holder and political science graduate student, I just really enjoy talking about this stuff. Spongebob is my favorite show, and Squid on Strike has been memed with communist imagery. I could have just focused on specifically what Squidward was saying in his speech and extrapolated from that only. But I also wanted to give some general history about race and labor because of those books I had read and because of the political climate today. Misinformation spreads easily and constantly. Not saying everything I said here was a complete picture of the associated topics, but hopefully the introductory nature and supporting details promote a little bit of intellectual curiosity. I do not want this video to be an end-all be-all. That, along with academic integrity, is why I point to other videos, websites, and books. I mean, I'm a white guy living in America making a video essay for Raw's sake. I am the Buzz Lightyear meme. Please take a look at all the people and works that are referenced throughout this, and then look at what those people and works referenced. Keep looking for more information that comes up as you hear about it in what you're learning. SpongeBob, games, and music are all things to enjoy without needing to think past their surface, but sometimes it's fun and even revealing exercise to try and look deeper, even if the creators didn't or did mean anything by the content they presented. I understand many get frustrated by the everything is political idea, so one way I've seen as maybe a more palatable way of thinking of it is more that humans are cultural beings with the power to interpret and introspect. You don't have to view Squid on Strike as communist literature. After all, SpongeBob clearly misinterprets what Squidward meant. Or did he? Maybe SpongeBob was the true revolutionary with his action of dismantling the physical Krusty Krab. Maybe this was just a video I wanted to make for fun with a bit of hope that people would find some part of it either breathe out of nose funny or interesting enough to prompt further looking into the difficulties working people have faced and still face in the world today. If the politics discussed does interest you, or you want to make some kind of contribution, look for what is available and doable for you personally. As of the time of releasing this, we have been seeing a lot of things that do not look good for both the progressive political stances expressed in this video and democracy in general. Thinking about from an individual level, you do not have to be the entire movement. No one should be either. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. are great, but we need a bunch of small points of effort from a lot of people to gradually gain our needs and demands.
Are you waiting for MLK to rise from the grave and lead us? Don't you know how they needed us?
I have heard from a couple political activists and government officials at my university recently. Here's a plug for the Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Project in the description as well. And a few concepts reveal themselves in these conversations. We can't get caught up in wanting to change the world overnight. Even massive revolutions like the French Revolution shifted back into autocracy with the Reign of Terror first and then Napoleon later. This lecture from Iowa auditor Rob Sand, given at Iowa State University, encapsulated this idea with the Seneca Falls Convention example, where women didn't get the right to vote until 80 years afterwards. There was also a discussion of how college students swung right in this past election, so express how you think things need to change to your local left-leaning groups to recoup such demographics. Another organization I would recommend checking out if you want to express some agency in trying to address the issues we're dealing with today, might I suggest the United Nations Association. I believe membership is actually free for people under the age of 26, and it's a way to get yourself informed about worldwide happenings and even potentially involved, depending on how much you want to interact with it. I know this video is mostly about American politics, but nowadays the entire world is irrevocably interconnected. Even if you do lean to the idea that a country should look after its own citizens first, the world's too tied up to really follow that line of thinking to the letter. We're seeing measles outbreaks in the US again. There are measles outbreaks that continue happening across the world. That's just one example, too. Diseases, invasive species, global warming don't pay attention to national borders. Those are things that will affect everyone because that's just the nature of them. Tuberculosis may be something that people only suffer from mostly nowadays in less developed countries, but that can change easily if drug-resistant variants of those diseases spread. And it'll be a lot easier for drug-resistant variants to spread if we keep doing what's happening now in our US government, defunding the drugs that are being sent to these countries to deal with these diseases. If those drugs stop, that means the diseases have time to respond and evolve. Drug resistance is going to be directly affecting Americans at some point if these sorts of cuts continue to happen. Don't give in to doomerism either due to the fact that we can't exact the change we want quickly. Be wary of instant gratification and mere catharsis. Find what communities are doing things to try and make a difference and support them how you can. I didn't even know about that Teddy Roosevelt group until recently. The Black Panthers ensured kids had breakfast alongside all of their other operations. Colleges have political clubs for organizing and communicating. Find out what you can do, and make sure others are aware of what they can do, and how as well. Anyway, here's how Bernie can still win.